Let's just assume that you're working on a low-budget sci-fi film, and the script calls for your actors to use some futuristic-looking tools and gadgets, but the budget simply isn't there to build them. So, what are you going to do? Well, in this video I'll be showing you 3 pieces that I made very quickly using nothing more than household junk that I had laying around in one of my spares boxes. And what I produced may give you some ideas for your project, so let's take a look. The first item is perhaps the simplest and the quickest to put together. Notice that I didn't say build here, as that's stretching the reality somewhat. I'm calling this one the radiation detector, but only because it's inspired by just such a device as seen in 1980s Doctor Who, and also I've used some very similar parts, namely various garden hose connectors from Hoselock. If it's good enough for the BBC, then it's certainly good enough for me. The length of this was dictated by the old radio aerial that forms a central spine over which various hose connectors were added for the main body. Down on the tail end of this is a battery housing from a flashlight that I actually used to make the very first iteration of this way back in 1990, so that's a nice little personal callback for me. Sitting up at the top is a wire dispenser spool from my parents' old garden strimmer, or weed whacker as some folks like to call them. This is a detail that I rather like, and I'm glad to have finally got to use it on a project after all these years. Travelling further up the prop, atop the aerial is an axle and wheel from an early 1980s Lego moon buggy kit with various greeblies added to it just to hide what it really is. Last of all, part of an old sonic screwdriver toy has been employed as the activation switch, down on the midriff there. In keeping with the original BBC prop, I used automotive paint to spray this in just one colour. However, rather than a simple pass of matte black, I used gunmetal grey at different intensities to modulate the look of various sections across the prop. This was primarily to accent areas and give a bit of interest to the piece. Finally, it was gently weathered down with artist acrylics and sealed. This particular prop actually took longer to paint than it did to put together. From start to finish, less than half an hour, if you don't count the 15 years of it sitting in a box waiting for me to finish it, that is. The films Alien and Aliens had a particular effect on me, namely the gritty and grungy build aesthetic that they used. This went on to inform how I personally went about making a lot of my own pieces across the years, as it was just so real and believable in the context of the tech being simply made up for a movie. So, having spotted the hand welder in Aliens back in 1986, I wanted to have a go at making something similar for myself, though it would take me about 35 years to finally get around to actually doing it. Christmas Day 2021, and I was at a loose end. The presents had all been opened and the big meal wasn't ready yet, so I decided to throw some parts together, and after about a quarter of an hour, this is what I ended up with. It would then go on to take me another 15 months to progress it to the painting stage, but at least I got there in the end. As you can probably tell, the main body of this is a garden sprayer, chiefly my parents' garden sprayer from when I was a kid. On the business end is another Lego moon buggy axle and wheel, this time fixed on back to front with the axle jutting out and serving as the welder or the lance. The grip block from Lord knows where is seated just behind the buggy wheel to beef out the detail and obscure the original spout end here. Meanwhile, serving the same purpose but for the water in feed, a hose connector has been glued to the bottom end. Up on the top, all this complicated technical looking busy stuff is nothing more than some hacked up vintage toys. The eagle-eyed among you should be able to recognise the gunner seat from the original release of the Ken and Millennium Falcon toy that I've screwed into place here as a platform for everything else to sit on. Tucked in at the back there is a cockpit from a cheap plastic digger toy, and staying on that theme, all those actuators that look like they might actually do something is in reality the bucket arm, sans the bucket, from another much larger scale die-cast digger toy. I then decorated this with a few greeblies from leftover model kits to break up some of the bare sections and make it look a bit more technical, as if they serve some kind of purpose. Now, the paint application is very particular. First off, it was my son who actually suggested that I paint this red when I asked him what colour he thought it should be after I instructed him not to say grey. He'd seen some Milwaukee brand tools and thought that their scheme might be rather suited to this. In terms of weathering, you'll notice that it's rather heavy here. This is a direct callback to my dad's worksite toolkit. He used to drive cranes for a living, and from time to time he'd have to maintain or repair his machine. Now, the tools he'd use were always absolutely covered in oil and grime from all that hard use out in the field, so much so that you could barely tell what colour they were under all that filth. This has always stuck with me, and whenever I think about maintenance tools, that's what I imagine, so I've adopted that look for this, and the next piece. Speaking of which... The final piece that I want to show you is perhaps the most alien looking of all three examples here today. I wanted to make something that doesn't quite fit with our standard idea of what we think a tool should look like, in that its purpose is beyond our earthly comprehension. I'm calling this a null point generator. The main body of the prop, the slightly egg-shaped thing with the three legs there, if you hadn't already noticed, is a back massager from around 2005. Being absolutely terrible at its one and only function, it quickly found itself in my parts collection bin, ready to be employed for other measures at some point in the near future. As soon as I saw it, I knew exactly what I'd be using it for, so its fate was immediately sealed. The first thing that I did was to gut out the motor and reroute the activation switch whilst preserving the internal illumination. Next, I added to the top of it to create what I call a field distribution array. Now, why do I say this, you may ask? Well, you have to make up stuff while you're building, as otherwise you're building blind. Its fictional purpose dictates and informs how you go about the project, which gives it a sort of believable internal logic. So in strict order of stacking here, this is what we have. First, an offcut of ABS tubing from a recent robot project that I built. This has then been decorated with more model kit greeblies, and a new activation toggle switch has been routed through the front to illuminate the lower lights. Actually, this toggle switch is recycled from an old film prop that I made back in 1996. Upper level, and we have a heatsink from an old halogen lamp, and on top of that, yep, you've guessed it, the radar dish from my childhood Kenner Millennium Falcon toy. That toy has serviced a fair few of my builds over the years, so it's always nice and good to recycle things. The last thing that went into this prop was the, now brace yourselves, I'm about to use a technical term here, lump on the front of the egg. Whilst building this prop, I just felt that this area needed something here to break up the huge expanse of nothingness. It's simply a model kit tank turret with various bits stuck to it, all from plane and warship kits, just to disguise what it really is. Lastly, I went to town on painting it. First, grey automotive spray was laid down, and then over that, various washes in different intensities of acrylic, black, brown and ochre were applied to mimic dirt, grime and grease that's accumulated over the years. And that was it. Completed in just over an hour. All three of these sci-fi gadgets were very easy to make from items that I had laying around my house. The only real challenge was assembling all those interesting shapes into an aesthetically pleasing way that would convincingly convey the idea that these really were tools from another time and perhaps another planet. Props, and indeed the more exotic science fiction style props, don't have to be expensive. All you need is a collection of old junk, throw in a bit of artistic license and some imagination, and you'll be away crafting fantastic worlds in next to no time. Well, thanks for watching. I hope this has given you some ideas for your own projects. Please feel free to leave a comment and tell me what you've been up to. Drop me a like, a donation through Super Thanks if you care to do so, or simply subscribe if you want to. But until next time, I hope you're well, here's some other projects for you to have a look at, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care now.